at the table of Los Fresnos, and on this channel I am Brad's brother, and we're in Los Fresnos, Texas, which is about 15 minutes as a crow flies from the border. So we're in deep South Texas, and this evening we're out, and I got about a few minutes, or I thought I'll go ahead and do Rhythms of Grace here. I don't know if I get a chance to do it later on, and I got a brief window here to do it. But I thought for this holiday season at the table, we've been going through the first chapter of the book of Matthew, and of course that's where we find the story of the birth of Jesus. And we've been looking at chapter 1 and the early verses where we find Jesus and his family tree, his Ancestry.com. It's where we find what we call the genealogy of Jesus, the beginnings of Jesus, his family from the Old Testament. And I just thought it's going to take just a couple of minutes to talk about this family tree and encourage you in this holiday season, because it's been an encouragement to me. One of the things that happens when we look at this genealogy, in fact, you can go on the internet and you can get on, you can look this up on Google, or you can look it up on YouTube or whatever, talking about Jesus and his genealogy, and it traces him through the line of David and through the line of Abraham in the Old Testament. King David especially becomes a running theme throughout the book of Matthew. But one of the things that happens in this genealogy is we come across 4 women, and typically in Jewish genealogies, women aren't listed, but Matthew does here, and Matthew wants us to see that he wants us to see something important about these women. And one of the things he's doing is he's showing how Jesus is using imperfect sinners. Now, we can do this with the men too, because the men the men in this genealogy, the men in the family tree in Matthew 1 and the first 17 verses, a lot of those men, some of them are just bad characters. Some are like King David, and he's obviously not perfect, and we know his story, and Solomon as well. But we've got these 4 women, and the 4 women are fascinating studies. We're not going to get into all the reasons why they're here. But we're talking about Rahab, we're talking about Ruth, we're talking about Bathsheba, and we're talking about Tamar. And they all share scandal in the Old Testament. There are 4 ladies that you would not expect to be in Jesus' family tree. And yet they show up here. Matthew wants us to see that Jesus came from a family line of sinners in a virgin birth. That's at the end of the Matthew 1 through 17. In a line of sinners, 4 sinners. By the way, there's a 5th woman at the end of the genealogy, which we won't get into. In fact, I'll probably do that a little later again, and I'll let you guys in on that devotional. But Mary is the 5th woman in this genealogy. But these 4 all share scandal, and Tamar and Rahab and Ruth and Bathsheba, and they all have a sexual scandal in terms of their background and their backdrop. Again, you would not expect to see this in the family line of the Messiah, the one that had been promised. You would expect Matthew to ignore some of those things. So one of the things that happens, though, everybody kind of sees, okay, these are 4 imperfect women, and they show up, and isn't this how God uses his grace? And it's true. God uses his grace for these women, and using these women to bring along the Messiah line. But one of the things that happens as we begin to talk about these women, especially in Jesus' line, is that God, and here's the common theme, that God makes lemonade out of lemons. In other words, there is a bad situation, and in these bad situations, God, even though what's going on is bad, God is going to somehow make it good. In fact, we interpret Romans 8:28 a lot of times that way. That's that famous verse that all things work together for good. That while you do something bad, God is going to somehow manipulate everything so that in order it all becomes good. God making lemonade out of lemons. And these women, they then are the lemons. I don't think that's the way we're supposed to read these women. In fact, I don't think that's the way we're supposed to read the Old Testament. I don't think that's the way we're supposed to read the inclusion of sinners in Jesus' family tree. That, yeah, it was all sin, and somehow God just kind of, he just kind of orchestrated it all just so, in a gracious way. And by grace, he's just going to allow these women to participate in this grand story of Jesus. That God's making lemonade out of lemons. And I don't think God makes lemonade out of lemons. And that is not, again, we could be here all day talking about all the theology where that is an idea that's kind of an undercurrent running through the theology. That's not happening in the genealogy. In fact, I don't think that's happening much in the Old Testament. God makes lemonade out of lemons. You know what God is doing? God is using, willfully and graciously, using sinners to bring about his Messiah by design. He's not taking simply a bad situation in order to bring good out of it. No, it was always going to be bad. The intentions. He drops himself many times throughout the Old Testament into the situation himself to bring about it. And he's working with sinners. He's dealing with sinners. He's with sinners. Using sinners. Using people like you and me to accomplish his purposes. In the midst of sin. In the midst of their sin. It's almost like God making lemonade out of lemons is something happened that was unexpected. And all of a sudden God's sitting there, okay, now I got to fix this. No, God's in the midst of the whole thing. He's part of the whole thing. He's with the sinners as they sin. And it's always imperfect. I think about Rebecca, and she's not mentioned here, but Rebecca and Tamar and Rahab. Those are all stories in which the women themselves are, the way they're described and the events going on in the Old Testament are things that I think, we call them anachronisms, where now we're foisting what we believe to be true back onto the stories. These women are held in high esteem by the text. And we go back and we say, you know what, we wouldn't have done it that way. You were sitting and doing that way, and God just decided he was going to use it anyways. No. In fact, a lot of what we look down on, God is actually blessing. God is actually using that. In fact, those women, imperfectly, are doing some of those things in faith. In faith. In fact, James says if it's not of faith, it's sin, which puts us in a quandary when we read those stories and we're like, oh man, this is just all messed up. And we're thinking, this is not how this is supposed to go down. Well, okay, yeah. Again, if all things being equal, it's not supposed to go down that way. But it does, because we're sinners. And in the midst of whatever it is, the bad situation, these women are expressing some very good and true faith. Rahab with the spies. Everybody wants to know, is it lying? Well, what about the lying? The text doesn't tell us. The text just says God blessed her, and it was of faith. And the text doesn't dissect where the line begins and where the line ends, and when it comes to all the stuff that was going on. And you want to talk about Tamar? Oh my. She believed the promise more than Judah did. And so in her imperfection, her faith, the way it went, again, God is not using or making lemonade out of lemons. He is using imperfect sinners. And imperfect sinners are buying into his and embracing his Messiah idea. They are. Even Rebecca, every single time, they're buying into the Messiah idea in their imperfection and as sinners. And so I just want to encourage you that wherever you are, whatever you're doing, whatever's going on in your life for this Christmas, that Jesus is with you. You understand that? And Jesus is working with you, and Jesus is working in your life, and Jesus is working in your heart. He's working in my heart. He's probably working in my heart right now. He's working in our hearts in the midst of our mess. And we still sin. We're still sinners. And in the midst of our sin, he's still using us somehow, some way. I don't know. That's grace. And that is grace. Because grace is no strings attached. No strings attached. And repeat after me. No strings attached. That's grace. And that's our rhythms of grace. God's not making lemonade out of lemons. He's using sinners. He's using you to accomplish his purposes. And his purposes, by the way, is to love you. And he died for you. The one thing, God's will for your life today, you know what God's will for your life today is? You know what God's will for your life is this Christmas season? To love you. That is his will for your life. His will for your life is to love you. And for you to embrace that in faith and just receive it. Be passive. You're a passive receptor of his grace and forgiveness and his love. That's his will for your life. Every single day, every single moment. Because that's all he does. It's what he wants to do. That's our Rhythms of Grace on this Tuesday. And I hope you have a great rest of your week. And like I say, it's always good to be with you there at Nature Coast. And one of these days I'm going to get back there and see y'all again and be great. But until next time, remember to rest in Jesus this evening. Always believe his promises. He always has you.